I know it's late in the day, so thank you to the people who managed to stay on, and hopefully we'll attract some more people. So whether you're joining us in person here or online, I am delighted to welcome you to this session on strengthening science policy interfaces in support of effective decision making. My name is Preet Lidder. I am technical advisor in the FAO Chief Scientist Office, and I am very pleased to be moderating this session today. So as we've heard multiple times over the course of this week, that halfway into the implementation of Agenda 2030, a lot of the progress made towards its food and agriculture-related targets has stagnated or even worse, reversed. And this is leading to problems because how do we end poverty and hunger? How do we improve nutrition and health? And how do we combat climate change? And again, we all agree that agri-food systems need to be transformed if they are going to be able to feed and nourish the world's population while also reducing their impact on the environment. And for agri-food systems to be transformed, coherent policies are crucial. We cannot do this if we don't have the right policies in place. And what does this need? This requires broader engagement and societal engagement with all aspects of science, but also a greater democratization of knowledge. There is also consensus that decision-making should be informed by the best available science and evidence. But yet, making the connections between knowledge, decisions, the resulting actions and outcomes are not always straightforward. There is also a striking imbalance between just the sheer amount of knowledge that is available and the capacity to make sense of it. Now, with regards to agri-food systems, the science policy interface landscape is quite broad, and it includes a plurality of actors and initiatives at various scales that generate, synthesize, assess, and use knowledge for different reasons, at different levels of granularity. And strengthening, connecting, and streamlining these interfaces is absolutely key if we want to transform our agri-food systems. So how do we develop effective mechanisms for actively connecting knowledge with policy actions through deliberative dialogue? How can we co-create, integrate, and synthesize knowledge from different knowledge systems to combine those insights? How can we engage a wider range of voices and connect stakeholders across multiple scales? How can we address barriers to change? And these include power asymmetries, path dependencies, conflicts of interest, risks, and uncertainty. Well, these are some of the questions we are going to attempt to answer in this session today. Unfortunately for me, I don't have to answer them. We have a stellar lineup of speakers who will do the heavy lifting. So without further ado, let me invite the FAO Chief Scientist, Dr. Ismahan Elouafi, to give us her opening remarks. Ismahan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Preet, and really a pleasure to be with you today to open this session on science policy interface. I think we don't need to remind ourselves of how big are the challenges in front of us, be it climate change, be it biodiversity loss, be it poverty, malnutrition. It is really huge. And it is recognized now, as Preet just said, that we need to transform our agri-food system. But it has to be, that transformation has to be based on the best evidence and the best science. This forum represents one small step toward that direction, to talk about how could we make sure that we are basing it on the best science and the best evidence. Integration of science and evidence into effective agri-food system decision-making processes remain a significant challenge. Science policy interfaces need to be reinforced to ensure that scientific findings can inform policymakers. So we all believe in it, but none of us yet have found the way to do it in a proper way or in an effective way. And this is not to say that all potentially useful information derives from science. It does not. There are numerous other sources of knowledge, and we have been talking about the importance of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, small-scale producer knowledge, to name only few. This is also not to say that policymakers are obliged to take scientific findings into account only. They have so many aspects, other aspects that they have to take into account. And Ian was just telling me that a few years ago, he saw a slide of a policymaker that shows their consideration, and there were 23 consideration, and evidence-based was one of them. So the issue is more concerned with making knowledge more accessible, more actionable, and policy relevant. Decision-making is also often influenced by numerous stakeholders with diverse values and with significant power asymmetries. Science policy interfaces must be managed as collaborative, non-linear processes in which scientists, knowledge holders, decision makers, and the representative of the general public are engaged in an interactive process. We require agility and transparency to co-create and integrate knowledge and feed it into policy and practice. Only when communication improves and becomes more effective in engendering the changes that are necessary will it be possible to generate better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life, leaving no one behind. FAO has always been aware of the challenge in bridging the gap between scientists, knowledge holders, policymakers, and the public, and has striven to encourage dialogue through providing neutral forums for a wide range of discussion and stakeholders and partners. And indeed, the purpose of today's session is to explore how science policy interface in depth defines the major stumbling blocks and discuss ways in which they might be overcome. This is very much in line with the Science and Innovation Strategy that was approved in 2022. And this is to support the implementation of our strategic framework for the decade 22 to 31, which is part and parcel of the Global Development Agenda 2030. So in that strategy, we had one pillar. The first pillar was on strengthening science and evidence-based decision-making. The strategy indicates that FAO will strengthen its contribution to SPI, to Science Policy Interface, at the national, regional, and global levels to support organized dialogue between scientists, policymakers, and other relevant stakeholders in support of inclusive science and evidence-based policymaking. And given that the UN Food System Summit has put in place national pathways that give us a really great entry point with the dialogue with the countries that have a proper national pathway that they are discussing at the national level. And of course, organizations like Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food System Summit, the HLPE, the IPBC, the IPCC, the IPBS, all those international fora of scientists that really are there to shed light on evidence and science for policymakers gonna be used and gonna be brought together to really learn from each other. Aligned with the strategy, FAO is developing draft guidance for strengthening science policy interface at the national level, and that work will be presented today by Selim. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I don't need to emphasize how important it is for us to understand how could we, as scientists and as knowledge manager, as knowledge generator, how could we really bring our voice to a policymaker in a way that is useful for that policymaker? I remember my time in the government of Canada, whereby we had 13 science-based agencies meeting on a monthly basis. And at a certain point, we said, well, there are 13, they're all science-based, so they believe in it. So what about we invite policy ADMs to join? It wasn't easy to get them in. They were too busy with their own agendas, and they were not so much interested in the science agenda. And finally, we got one to come from the 13th department. And when she came, the first thing she said, how do you define your priorities? How do you start your agenda? Do you start with a policy question? And that was really an eye-opener for me. She said, if you start with a policy question that stems from the need of the government, they will come and use it. And that really changed completely the dynamic of that 13 departments that are science-based to see how they interact better with the policymakers. Thank you very much for being with us quite late in the day. And over to you, Preet. Thank you.
Thanks. So thanks so much, Ismahan, also for reiterating that there are numerous other sources of knowledge in addition to science, including indigenous people's knowledge, local knowledge, and traditional knowledge. I would now like to welcome Dr. Salim Louafi, who's Deputy Director for Research and Strategy at CIRAD, France, to provide us with a scene-setting presentation. And as Ismahan indicated in her opening remarks, FAO is in the process of developing draft guidance for strengthening science policy interfaces at the national level. And the work is being done in collaboration with Salim. So he's going to talk to that.
Many thanks, Preet, and many thanks to FAO and the Chief Scientist Office for associating me and my organization to this important work on science policy interface and inviting me to speak to this very important session on of the World Food Forum. So first, let me introduce by recalling just what has been mentioned and showing you the three pillars that both Ismahan and Preet referred to, which compose this first ever science and innovation strategy that was endorsed by the FAO Council in June 22. And this strategy then is composed of three mutually reinforcing pillars. The one which interests us here is the strengthening science and evidence-based decision-making, but there is also a pillar on supporting innovation and technology at the regional and country level, and reinforcing FAO capacity to better serve members. And that's those three pillars are also supported by two enablers, the transformative partnerships and innovative funding and financing, and also grounded this strategy is grounded in 7 guiding principles, which I'm not going to read here, but that you can find on the right of the screen. So in line with the action plan of the FAO Science and Innovation Strategy, FAO is precisely developing some draft guidance on strengthening science and policy interfaces at the national level to help countries to navigate an increasingly complex institutional landscape on science policy interface for agri-food system that, as Preet mentioned, include a plurality of initiatives and actors at different scales. And also, on top of this, at the global level, there are also different policy processes that focus on various aspects of agri-food system, and for which implementation of many resolutions must happen at the national level, aligned with the specific gaps, needs, constraints, and priority and context of each country. This makes it really essential and critical to develop such guidance to help country. And to do this, the Chief Scientist Office of FAO has established a thorough process that consisted in a series of activities, starting with the commissioning of 2 background studies, an online consultation, a desktop study informed by key informant interviews, an in-depth literature review in the very rich field of science and technology studies that deals with the institutional design and functioning of science policy interface, and also an expert workshop. And I will very quickly go through these different activities to conclude in my last draft with where we stand in terms of content with this work on the draft guidance, which is an ongoing process. So first, let me give some kind of indication on or overview of the 2 background papers that has been commissioned to better understand the experience at the national, regional, and global level with regard to science policy interface. So the first one at the national level aim at unpacking national level models of science policy interface in general, but also for agri-food system more specifically. So this then first paper provide an overview of existing models to support the use of evidence at the national level, and 3 conceptual high-level models are presented in this diagram. On your right, the production-focused model, then the policy-oriented model on the left, and the integrated model. They are not static, and their application can shift over time, and knowledge and actors can also move among them. More than one of the models can be in place in any single setting at the same time. We need to think about these models more as ideal types or heuristics rather than representation of reality. The first model put really the weight on the evidence generation side, and it's often framed as science speaks truth to power. These models tend to value strong scientific knowledge, sometimes to the exclusion of other forms of knowledge, and not always with sufficient consideration of the methodological challenges in combining different types of disciplines and different knowledge systems, and the need to get also a better understanding of the policy demand. So on the left side, the policy-oriented model centers on policymakers and policy making, and is often referred as policy on top and science on top. It considers what kind of evidence is needed for and how it can be integrated in policy and planning processes. So the policymakers have the first and the final word. In the third model, the integrated model, that's really operates in the middle ground between evidence generation and policy making, and trying to actively unite various actors so that they can work together towards shared goals and better development outcome. Beside that, the paper also acknowledged the cross-scale challenges, i.e. the need for contextualizing global evidence and balancing it with local evidence. It also highlighted the need to recognize that research evidence is only one form of knowledge relevant for decision-making. So the second paper, for which I have been personally involved, focuses more on global science policy interfaces, and trying to develop a study to understand the characteristics and the function of science policy interface activities and organization that operates at the global level. And with the idea to provide a broad overview and comparison of how international SPIs work based on a set of categories that allow some kind of systemic comparison across them, among them. And for that, we've based our work on different sources, but mainly on publicly available information, since we couldn't afford in the time constraint, in the short time period, to generate new data for this study. But we've come up with a simplified framework to provide a set of constructs and metrics to characterize and compare global SPI in 4 broad categories: the purpose and origin, the scope and governance, the co-production structure and process, and the learning process. And for each category include, obviously, several subcategories. And for the sake of visualization and synthesis, we came up also with a summary estimate of complexity, co-production, and learning that I will show in just one moment. To do this, we've studied 10 different international global scale SPI that related to the topic of agri-food system in the domain of agriculture, health, and environment, but also 2 international regional SPI that span 2 continents each. So here's an overview, and I don't want to spend too much time in the details of this graph, but it's meant really to show you the very important variability of SPI and actually the absence of clear patterns that could be explained by difference in the nature of the domain, as well as the fact that they have uneven capacities, resources, and also legal mandate or interest of those SPI. Yet, those science policy interface wrestle with the same kind of similar challenges and come at them in a very different and fragmented way, sometimes having to reinvent the wheel in the process. So enhancing our understanding on the ways and options that exist to address those similar challenges is really critical to provide guidance for those interested in, at the national level, in avoiding too much fragmentation and inefficiencies. So To continue with the process of for developing those draft guidance, we've also built this work on an online consultation that was organized to further identify and understand the barriers and opportunities for scientists and other knowledge holders like indigenous people and small-scale producers to contribute to informing policy in a more efficient, inclusive, resilience and more efficient, inclusive, resilience and sustainable agri-food system. And the consultation received 91 valuable contributions from a bit less than 40 different countries. So at the end, the online consultation, the background study, the key informant interviews, the desktop study and the literature review, plus the expert workshop allow us to come up with a first draft on guidance that we are still in the process of developing for strengthening science and policy interface at the national level. And to conclude, even if it's still early to communicate precisely about the content of this guidance, let me give you some initial overview of the content of such draft guidance. To make it really simple and usable, the draft guidance will mainly include two main components. The first one is the core element to be considered for a functional science policy interface. And those are principles such as the credibility, the relevance, and the legitimacy of those interfacing processes between science and policy. And also issue related to the aim and design and structure of those science policy interface. And then it will also include a second aspect that would really more specifically deal with the operational side of those science policy interface in terms of processes, in terms of tools and capacities. It will really specifically address the issue of cross-scale interaction of the tools and mechanisms and methods for knowledge co-creation, integration and synthesis, the issue of scales and capacities, and the issue of monitoring, evaluation and learning. So needless to say that that it is also foreseen that the draft guidance will go through a wider consultation process for soliciting feedback and further refinement. To conclude, let me emphasize that we are very much aware that since circumstances differ according to really specific situation, a fit-for-purpose approach is needed. And we need to tailor to the national needs, to think about tailoring to the national needs. So accordingly, we also approach the guidance document also as a tool to launch really a learning process around science policy and interface. And it could be really considered at the country level in a process either to strengthen existing or to establish new agri-food system SPIs. And the guidance really is envisioned to be improved as a second iteration, and I would say as a constant iteration of the guidance, by learning from those experiences of implementation of this guidance at the national level. So thank you very much. Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Salim, for that very nice presentation. And the two background papers that Salim mentioned will be published very soon. The draft guidance, as he said, is a work in progress, and we do hope that it'll go through a wider consultative process. We'll receive more feedback and probably have it in a more refined state early next year. So let me now introduce you to our panelists, and 4 of those panelists are joining us online. Can we have the panelists online, please? Maybe I can start with the ones who are, oh, here they are. Hello, everyone. So first we have Dr. Andrea Hinwood, who serves as the Chief Scientist of the United Nations Environment Program. Next is Dr. Inaya Ezzedine, who's a member of the Lebanese Parliament and chairs the Women and Children Parliamentary Committee and the SDG 2030 Agenda Parliamentary Commission. She's also the National Convener for Food System Transformation. We have Dr. Jennifer Clapp on the stage, Vice Chair of the Steering Committee of the High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security and Nutrition of the CFS. She's also a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Next is Dr. Luciane da Costa from the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, Brazil. Going back online, we have Thembi Mwavakamba, Director of Policy Research and Analysis at the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, more commonly known as FENARPAN. And last, but definitely not the least, is Dr. Patrick Caron, Vice Chair of the CGIAR System Board, Director of the Montpellier Advanced Knowledge Institute on Transitions, and Chair of Agropolis International. Let's give them a round of applause before we start. Andrea, I'll start with you first. Transforming agri-food systems, especially in the face of climate change, entails taking a holistic approach and a call for actionable knowledge that is equitably and inclusively produced, openly shared, widely trusted, and relevant to decision makers. Can you tell us a bit on the role that the UN can play?
Thanks, Preet, and hello, everybody. I'm sorry I can't join you in person. So the UN is uniquely placed to actually help these challenges. Why? Because we are governed largely by member states, because we have a whole range of agencies that operate at the global level, but also we have country teams and implementation at the national and country level as well, and implementing agencies that help us out. But I first want to talk to this challenge of environment, and in particular the role that agriculture plays with respect to the environment, but then the feedback loop of changes in the environment and agriculture. So I just think we need to be really clear. The food system is responsible for about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And that, of course, is contributing to climate change. It's a main contributor to global methane emissions, which contributes to climate change, but also air pollution. It's a leading driver of land use change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. And of course, it's a source of nutrients, eutrophication in the environment. And it's one of the largest causes of freshwater withdrawals. And then not to mention the role of chemicals in the environment, which end up in our food and in our bodies. They're all interrelated. And the beauty of the UN system is we have the opportunity, the fact that I'm here today talking at an FAO program, and that we do communicate with our other sister agencies, the World Health Organization, the WMO, etc. And so how do we actually work in practice to improve food security and provision of food for all, while also protecting the environment and actually reversing some of the damage that we've done? The science policy interface means that we need to actually translate the science. And that's not just environmental science. That's actually what I call the science of solutions. Solutions can only be developed with multiple disciplines and stakeholders, as has already been outlined by the previous speakers. Importantly, I had a perfect lesson on translating science today. And one of the challenges of translating science at a global level, which is then tangible to people who need to use it at a national or local level, I had to explain a table. And the person I was explaining it to said to me, "But I don't understand the table." I'm saying, well, it's looking at what the existing food system is, and if we implemented these changes, this would be positive here, and that's what these dots are showing. And she's going, "But I don't understand what the cow is in relation to these 3 dots." It was a perfect example of translating information. And I kept saying, "Yes, but here's the science, and this is why that's got this and why that's got that." The bottom line is we need to translate this. So if this is happening in a fora of people who understand the issues, we also need to be translating them for those who don't necessarily understand them as well. So I think in terms of the UN system and improving the science policy interface, it is all about being in the room with policymakers. It's also making sure that the global meets the local, but the local informs the global as well, so that when we're actually providing some of the solutions, they are relevant for those that need to use them. And that means open, accessible, transparent data, information, and knowledge that is shared equitably, that we have access to this information, which means we need to address the issues of developing countries who don't even necessarily have internet access. If you look at least developed countries, etc. And we need to make sure that we also create trust in that information by making it open, accessible, transparent, and relevant to who needs to use it. So I think that if we focus on greater stakeholder engagement, that we actually provide information in an open way, and that we actually listen. And I mean real listening, where you're actually listening to alternate voices that might actually have solutions that you haven't even thought about yet. And I think we have a unique opportunity as a UN system with our country teams and with our sister agencies to actually drive positive changes in terms of agri-food systems. And I'm very much looking forward to the rest of this panel. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Andrea. We do need to translate the science of solution that you very nicely put it, which is developed with multiple disciplines and also multiple stakeholders involved. I now want to turn to Dr. Ezzedine. In your dual role as a policymaker and also as a national food system convener, how can the independence of a national level SPI on agri-food systems best be ensured and supported, especially considering that conflicts of interest and trade-offs exist? Just a second, we don't hear you. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I would have loved to be with you in person this evening. However, due to the situation here, I was planning to arrive the same night, to go the same night the attack on the Baptist hospital happened, and with the volatile security situation in Lebanon, I decided to stay home and to be available whenever needed. Let me first introduce myself. You said in the beginning that you talked about being a policymaker. I'm actually a medical doctor, pathologist, laboratory medicine scientist, and a cytopathologist, in addition to be a member of parliament. And this way I am keeping in close contact with my fellow scientists and also with legislators and legal personnel in the parliament. This puts us all, my inner circle or my team, in a special position where we have and we share commitments to making things better. And I do believe, and I'm an advocate of that parliaments and parliamentarians can make things better through the diverse roles. This is how scientists in my team are committed to socializing what you call democratizing, I call socializing science into science that has direct positive impact on the society and the life of people. And legislators are always trying, or should be always trying, to seize opportunities to improve societies and serve the people's right, interests, and needs. Today, I will tell you the story, a successful story, where as a parliamentarian, I used my right to start a process that does not necessarily end with me, where in collaboration with scientific community and other partners, we co-produced and co-created a platform for science policy interface. It all started in 2019 when I read in a non-scientific newspaper an article about the alarmingly increasing resistance to colistin. Colistin, for those who don't know, is a very precious, we call it last resort antibiotic that is used in intensive care for critically ill patients who have resistance infections that are resistant to life-threatening infections and resistant also to all other antibiotics. So it's very precious and we cannot allow ourselves to lose it. First, I thought that I should make sure that this piece of information is really credible, accurate, and based on solid evidence. This is why I reached out to some of the dean of the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Science in the American University of Beirut, where this study was performed. And I met with the scientists and I looked at the papers, and we thought that this is credible enough to trigger a process at the policy and regulation level. We formed in the beginning a small team of the knowledge holders with myself and the dean of the department, and we started looking and collecting data from international at the global level. And building on this data, we started analyzing the scientific data that we have in Lebanon, and simultaneously, I launched a process, a thorough mapping, in-depth mapping of our legal and legislative framework for the supply chain of cholesterol into the country. Over a 2-year period, this was during the COVID lockdown, we held like a series of 8 meetings, exhaustive and inclusive, under the umbrella of the SDG Commission, in the presence of all policy and knowledge makers, private sector, the syndicate of poultry sector, the customs, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the smallholder farmers. Meetings started in February 2020, and every meeting we used to set recommendations and agenda for the next meeting after presenting the data, the scientific data and research that we have. And we ended up with a workshop where we have all these stake and knowledge holders in presence of the chairpersons of the Agriculture and the Health Committee in the Parliament, and also the relevant ministers, and FAO, World Food Programme, ESCWA, and WHO. I cannot list in this period of time the findings that we have, but we traced back the emergence of this to resistance to cholesterol in the poultry sector from chicken, who were given the cholesterol as a growth promoter and as a prevention for a GI disease. And as a result of these practices, we had contamination in the environment through the fecal material of the chicken. It was into the soil, the irrigation, water. It was also systemically in some vegetables where it was present. We also traced the thorough legislative and regulatory mapping, showed us the absence of a robust regulation, regulatory and legislative loopholes, lack of awareness. It will be also, all of this data will be published in a study about SPIs. We had to deal with many conflict of interest, denial, justification, and resistance. However, especially from the private sector and from the syndicate of the poultry sector, but due to the concerted and determination that we had, in April 2022, the Ministry of Agriculture, which was a little bit reluctant during the first year, we issued a decree banning the import, the exchange, and the use of cholesterol in all its forms in the poultry sector and in the animal sector. And now we are in the process of putting the tools and mechanisms for the follow-up. We had to face a lot of trade-offs and make a lot of trade-offs and hurdles that we had to face. The first hurdle was at the level of the trade-off is environmental and food production. The second trade-off that we face is at the level of the availability of food and food security, because in some areas they prioritize availability of food over safety and quality and of nutrition. The third and very important trade-off and hurdle is the balance that we have to make between financial profit-driven use of antibiotic and financial gain and the public health, because some practices compromise the well-being of both human and animal population and nature. In conclusion, I can say that we have the multifaceted relationships emphasize the necessity for a comprehensive understanding and concerted efforts to devise integrated strategies. We have to have a holistic approach intertwining health, environment, economy, and societal values. And of course, strengthening science policy interface can have a transformative potential for our food systems. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Etzedine, for giving that very concrete example, and also how you were able to manage the trade-offs and also address the conflicts of interest. And also like what you said about socializing science that has a positive impact on society and the people. I want to go next to Jennifer, who's on the stage with us. Jennifer, given the divergent priorities and the vast power differentials that exist within agri-food systems, what measures need to be taken to ensure that knowledge is credible, relevant, and legitimate in the eyes of all stakeholders?
Thank you, Preet, for that great question. I'm really glad you asked it because power differentials are often the elephant in the room that we're afraid to talk about. And I think it's good to talk about it in the context of science policy interfaces. But first, just a reminder, because Preet said there are competing interests as well in food systems. And it's good to be reminded that food systems serve multiple functions in society. We're all familiar with it, but we should be cognizant of that when we think about science policy. Food systems obviously provide nourishment, they provide livelihoods, they provide ecosystem services, they're a cornerstone of cultural norms, and they're also food is also a market commodity. And for some, food is a big business. And it's important to recognize these different interests and roles of food systems because they play a role when some of those players and some of their interests have more power than others within the food system. And this is a growing concern as we're seeing especially rising corporate concentration and consolidation in recent decades within the food system that give large multinational corporate players a degree of power in food systems that other players simply don't have. These big players, they have market power, which when they have a huge share of the market, it enables them to shape supply and demand conditions in their favor. But they also have other forms of power. They have the power to lobby governments, and they also have the power to fund research. And in addition, they have the power to give political donations. So in these various ways, large corporate players can play a role in shaping policy and in shaping science. And so we have to be aware of this when we're thinking about designing science policy interfaces that carry broad legitimacy. Because if science policy interfaces are giving advice that is not broadly seen to be legitimate by all stakeholders in the system, they're ultimately going to not be taken seriously by many people. So if you have a science policy interface captured by a corporate interest, you're going to find that 600 million small-scale producers and family farmers around the world are not going to take that advice seriously. So this is a really crucial issue that needs to be considered in the context of science policy interfaces. So, and these comments that I'm making, they come out of experience working with colleagues in the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition over the past 4 years, where I've been a panel member. And with those colleagues last year at the Science and Innovation Forum, we also discussed these kinds of issues and got together and pooled our knowledge to think about what are the key principles necessary for legitimate science policy interfaces. And we came up with this idea of what we call the I-TRACE principles, which is an easy way to remember them, but it stands for independent, transparent, accessible, consultative, and evidence-based. These are 5 key principles that are necessary for legitimacy in science policy interfaces. And coming back to Preet's question about how we make sure that science policy is legitimate in the face of power differentials, I'm just going to focus on 2 because I probably already used 4 of my 5 minutes. But one I want to really emphasize is independence. Independence is extremely important for science policy, or we could say science knowledge and policy interfaces. And it's important that those interfaces and the experts that belong to them or that work with them are free from conflicts of interest, and especially corporate conflicts of interest, because we can't have science policy interfaces captured by corporate players, because while the private sector does have a legitimate role to play in feeding into science, it can't dominate the process. And independence also means, I would argue, serving the public interest. And Ismahan mentioned in her comments at the beginning the importance of responding to the demands of policy. And when we're talking about food policy, we're often talking about addressing the needs of the poorest, most marginalized, those most affected by food insecurity, and issues of sustainability and the environment. And these are issues in the public interest that need to be front and center in science policy interfaces and not responding simply to commercial interests. So that's really important. And also a part of independence is being balanced. And often, because there are competing interests in food system, there are often different ideas and perspectives about the way forward. We know that we all want food systems transformation, but there are many different models out there that people are putting forward. And so the role of an independent science policy interface is to take on these different perspectives and explain them and explain where there are divergences of opinion, and to weigh the evidence against the public interest. And it's a very complex process and difficult to achieve, but I think that's what science policy and knowledge interfaces should strive for. And then the second principle I really want to highlight is the role of consultation. And I think this is really vital for legitimacy, to be broadly consultative in terms of what sources of knowledge are and science are referenced in science policy interfaces. And it's important to include not just Western science, as was mentioned, but also other forms of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, but also lived experience of those who are experiencing hunger and malnutrition, as well as the plight of food system workers who are, and these are often, those who face the most challenges in food systems are the ones with the least power within those systems. So again, in terms of addressing power imbalances, it's important to hear the voices of those most affected by the problems within the system. And just to conclude, in our paper, which if anyone wants to read it, I'm happy to share a copy of it. But what we conclude is that this could be a starting point for thinking about ways to develop metrics or measures to evaluate different science policy interfaces to see how they fare on these different principles, which are all interlinked. But it helps to give, in a sense, an idea of the legitimacy and efficacy of these different kinds of science policy interfaces, but also something to work towards. While we in the high-level panel of experts in food security and nutrition feel that HLP is striving to meet all of these objectives, I'm sure there are ways in which it can be improved, as we can always have continuous improvement. And I think that can be something that can motivate science policy interfaces to improve their legitimacy going forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, for reminding us about the I-TRACE principles, but also emphasizing that we need to listen to the voices of those who are affected and who often have the least power in agri-food systems. So now let's hear from Luciane. Luciane, what are the key factors that are instrumental in bridging the gap between science and policy in the context of agri-food systems at the national level? And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the Brazilian experience in particular with agri-food system SPIs, especially focusing on the achievements and the challenges which are confronted by the mechanisms in place.
Okay. Good evening. It's good to see all you here again. My name is Luciane Costa. I'm working in Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation in Brazil. And today I am going to describe the strategy the Ministry of implement to combat hunger and increase the domestic production of food. In Brazil, various departments of government are involved in combat, poverty, and eradication of hunger. For example, CONSEA, a consultative body run directly under the president, was recently reconstituted and is responsible for advising the president of the Republic on the formulation of the policies and the definition of guidelines for guaranteeing the human right to food, and integrates government actions with a focus on serving the part of the population that lacks the means to provide for its basic needs, in particular, the fight against hunger. CONSEI is currently preparing of the 6th National Conference on Food and Nutritional Security, which will be next December. The theme of this conference is eradicating hunger and guaranteeing human rights and democracy and equality. But today, I will talk about food and nutritional security in respect to what we do in Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation. In Brazil, the big agro industry has a focus on range scale commodity production for which the country is famous in its export. However, this model is significantly disconnected from the people's reality. Our churches indicates the Brazilians that Brazilians get 70% of their food from small-scale farm, not the large agro industry. And the issue here is that the population grows, small-scale production also needs to increase too. Moreover, these farmers need to improve productivity and efficiency to track with demand. This, in part, requires innovation and increased use of the technology. But this comes at an enormous and restrictive cost. At present, only 6% of family farms use mechanized methods. Consequently, the ministry has, in partnership with Embrapa, banks, various banks, and other government agencies, an agreement to combat hunger and help small-scale farmers in the acquisition of plant and harvesting technology that will deliver the efficiency needed to meet the country's food demand targets. That say, the agreement is just freshly started and is seed with around 16 million euros. It is expected to farm mechanization will increase to 7% over the next 2 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luciane, also for talking about the recently reconstituted CONSEA. In fact, in the draft guidance, we want to include an example as a case study on looking at what CONSEA has achieved, what were the challenges. So thank you for that.
Okay.
Now we'll move on to Thembi. Thembi, could you tell us a bit also about how non-state actors can articulate their interests in important agri-food system debates, and how can they actually participate in national level science policy interfaces?
Thank you, Prit, for that question, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this platform. I wish I was there in Rome with everyone else, but still happy to contribute to virtually. To answer your question, I think I want to start off by maybe mentioning that at FANAPAN, when we talk about non-state actors, we are talking about entities and organizations that are not affiliated with or controlled by government, and we categorize these in several groups that include farmer organizations, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations. Then we have the research and academic institutes on the one hand, international organization, the private sector, the media, and the press as well. So we believe there is a role for everyone to play. Of course, we know that the policy sphere has traditionally been largely a preserve of the state actors with little or no contributions from non-state actors. Yet we know that non-state actors can play a critical role in influencing public policy at national level and regional level, as well as global level, as we have had from the previous speakers. And I think why they are so critical is because they often provide alternative perspectives and expertise that can complement and challenge the policies put forth by governments and intergovernmental organizations. So in our work at FANAPAN, we really seek to enhance a sort of multi-stakeholder approach for researchers, farmer organizations, agribusinesses, parliamentarians, medias, and other non-state actors to be able to utilize evidence and articulate their interest in important food system policy debates. Of course, one thing that we are very clear on is that research that is divorced from policy debates and the policy development process is often largely ignored. Sometimes policies are made overnight. You hear about them on the radio, on the news, and you wonder what informed that decision. But what we try to promote is a multidimensional intervention strategy that includes research and analysis to ensure that the scientific quality, validity, and reliability of the policy recommendations that are going to the policymakers is assured. And since our inception in 1997, we've been conducting multi-stakeholder policy dialogue to enhance the voice of the less visible stakeholders that we have had so much about, the organizations, civil and civil society. And we sort of help to build their capacity to develop evidence-based options and equip them with skills for effective engagement to articulate their interests and those of their members in important agri-food policy processes. Sometimes it's about confidence building, so that they're able to stand up in a meeting where there are important people and they're able to say what their sort of issues, worries, concerns are, but they're also able to provide possible solutions, because sometimes the solutions lie within the farmers themselves, lie within the sort of community actors themselves. To give an example of some of the work that we have been doing over the years at FANAPAN, I think over the last 10 years, we have almost perfected the agriculture innovation platform approach with the support from the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, and of course, working with our partners at ICRISAT in Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. So the agriculture innovation platform approach, it facilitates dialogue between farmers, input suppliers, traders, transporters, retailers, regulators, and the research and development fraternity within the irrigation schemes where we are working. So we have been working in these irrigation schemes for almost 12 years now. And through the AIPs, the farming communities have been able to identify bottlenecks and opportunities in production, marketing, and within the policy environment. The project that we've been implementing, the Transforming Smallholder Irrigation in Southern Africa project, it has helped farmers through the established AIPs to articulate their interest and engage policymakers at local and national levels to increase understanding on irrigation-related issues and identify shortcomings of existing policies and propose new ones. I think one good example is having to deal with the sort of scheduling system of the water within the irrigation schemes, where the extension workers had a set schedule for when they release the water to the scheme, but sometimes it's not really necessary because it could have either rained or whatever. But because there was this sort of rigid rule that was set somewhere at the city somewhere that says on this day you release the water, we found that there was inefficient water use. But through the innovation platforms, they were able to engage in a discussion with the district officials, but also with the government officials sitting in ministries in faraway places such as Harare and in Dar es Salaam and in Maputo, to tell them that at times there is need to sort of make decisions at a local level, so that they, based on the conditions, are able to say, yes, the water can be released on this day, or no, the water cannot be released at this day. At a national level, I think as part of our broader mandate as a platform that brings together governments, policy analysts, and non-state actors to work together in policy development, we have been able to sort of work with partners. I'm thinking of the Food Systems Transformation in Southern Africa for One Health project that we are currently implementing, where we are taking an interdisciplinary and systems approach to evaluate the medium and long-term implication of food systems change in Southern Africa. So we combine stakeholder engagement and grounded research in the countries where we're working, which is Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia, with an integrated modeling framework to explore associated changes in animal, human, and environmental health. And just last week, I was in Morogoro in Tanzania, where we met with a diverse range of stakeholders. So we had people coming from the district offices, we had people coming from the Tanzania Bureau of Standards, we had people coming from Sokoine University, where we brought the stakeholders together to understand the varied experiences and priorities of transformation and how that can equitably be brought about in different contexts. So we spent about 2 days co-developing and collectively evaluating promising management strategies and policies and governance approaches that have a potential to catalyze transformative food systems changes. So there are different ways that we can engage different stakeholders in the science as well as policy space. I mean, we do not doubt that non-state actors are crucial in shaping agri-food policy debates. And as FunFund, we are doing our bit to facilitate their participation in the national SPI so that they can articulate their interest and impact agri-food policy discussions. Of course, I think one important thing is that we must acknowledge that the influence of non-state actors can vary significantly depending on their resources, expertise, and the extent to which they can mobilize public support and engage with policymakers. So often, you know, depending on where they are and how close they are to sort of policymakers, their impact or influence can vary. But as I close, I want to also just emphasize that it is important for non-state actors to remain persistent and patient. The influencing policy can be a sort of long game. It's not a short game. And it can also be a challenging process. So building credibility, fostering relationships, and maintaining a sort of sustained commitment to the cause is key to making a meaningful impact on agri-food policy debates. Thanks, Prit. I think I'll end here.
Thanks a lot, Thembi. So non-state actors indeed play a very key role in influencing public policies. And thanks also for telling us about the work of FANAR-PAN, in particular the work around the agriculture innovation platform approach, and also what you're doing around confidence building and trying to build credibility and foster relationships. Patrick's also been very patient. He's been waiting for his turn. So you wear many hats. And my question to you really is, while in the recent couple of years, there's been a proliferation of global science policy interfaces on topics related to agri-food systems, but there is lack of integration and coordination. And there are also important gaps in evidence related to issues such as trade-offs and synergies. So what can be done so that we can enhance collaboration amongst global expert panels for agri-food systems transformation?
Thank you, Prit. Greetings from Morocco. I also wish, like others, I could be with you. Congratulations to the World Food Forum and the FAO. This is really a very exciting session and about a key issue. I will first focus on the global scale. As you said, Prit, there has been a proliferation of experts panels during the last years to address global burning issues. And one, of course, immediately think about the IPCC that has been created to provide evidence and recommendations about climate change. And paradoxically, we observe in the same time that knowing and recommending is not sufficient to move beyond the blah, 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 to look up, not because we are stupid. There are reasons for that. This questions science policy interface. This also challenges our capacity to produce, share, and use actionable knowledge, as said by Ismahan. I mean, knowledge that can effectively contribute to transformation. Scientists and experts are thus invited to move beyond mere knowledge supply and alarm bell ringing to become knowledge brokers, to engage with policymakers and with key food system actors, and to promote coalition for change, as we just heard. To address the polycrisis we are facing, some say a perfect storm, we have also observed the multiplication of collegial expertise structures in different sectors, both at national and international levels. Most often they are created after a crisis or to anticipate a crisis, but they became so structured with specific patterns and institutional frameworks and the political pressures and timeframes that spontaneous cooperation does not take place usually. While in the same time, food systems are acknowledged, as highlighted during the recent UN Food System Summit, to sit at the heart of a nexus of complex issues, bringing together the blend of feed, protect, care, as reminded by Andrea. There is consensus that food systems offer a key levered challenge to address food environment, climate, and health-related challenges. And as a consequence, renewed intelligence is needed to address wicked problems and move away from the insufficiency of linear transfer of knowledge, especially in a context of increasing mistrust of science. And the expression pooling intelligence suggested by the Nature editors when publishing a correspondence 1 year ago perfectly illustrate these challenges. The Montpellier process has been designed and implemented with such a perspective. A process because of the different steps that have taken place over the last years. A process as we share a common vision for the future, as confirmed during the workshop we organized earlier this month with CGR and the University of Montpellier and its French academic partners, including CIRAD and INRAE. This workshop brought together high-level representatives from global expert panels, including IPCC, IPBS, the HLPE for Food Security and Nutrition, the One Health panel, from UN agencies and bodies, including the CFS, FAO, and the UN Food System Hub, from the UN Environmental Conventions, and from other international organizations. And participants explored in Montpellier the opportunity of a safe space for global expert panels to work together and design a joint roadmap, and for SPIs to structure a learning community of practice, as suggested by Selim, and improve the contribution of science to the SDGs and beyond 2030. We confirmed during the workshop that creating a safe space to reflect on SPI practice and expertise, compare and enter into dialogue would create value. We expressed our common wish to co-create the connecting tissue for improving the knowledge ecosystem efficiency. We are convinced that there is no need for a new structure, alliance, or new institutions, but rather to stimulate collaboration and reflexivity about science, action, and impact across the knowledge system. The Montpellier process is now established, credible, and defined, and it could hopefully strengthen advocacy for each SPI to carry forward with a joint message from the scientific communities calling for pooling collective intelligence. It could open avenues for panels and SPIs to cooperate through, for example, cross-peer reviewing, working groups, regular meetings, joint reports. It could also support learning communities of practice, optimizing collective expertise and SPIs. We all insisted on the need for a paradigm shift in mindset, on the need also to be pragmatic. This is not easy. Addressing the perfect storm requires articulating knowledge, intelligence, and action. It calls for sharing actionable knowledge, improving institutional arrangement where dialogue and convergence can take place, and strengthening the capacities of those who usually do not engage in these processes. And this is not easy. As you reminded, Preet, there are obstacles, different epistemic positioning regarding the role of science and its contribution to decision-making. that they are not always compatible. There is a lack of mutual knowledge and common language across disciplines and sectors, and thus trust. Different modus operandi and fragmentation of the expertise are always referred to them are difficult. And in addition, we are not starting from scratch. There are multiple collaboration across expert panels. They are often informal. The intention is not to reinvent the wheel, not to create a new structure, but to link expert panels and SPIs across scales and sectors to shape an evolving knowledge ecosystem and an intelligence connecting tissue. The next step, rendezvous in Montpellier, hopefully in March 2024. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patrick, for updating on the Montpellier process, and also what I always, two messages from you, pooling collective intelligence and also the need for a paradigm shift in the mindset. Now, I've been told we have a hard stop at 8 o'clock. It's been a long day for everyone, but we do have some time for questions and answers from the floor. And also I would encourage the participants who are joining us online to put in their questions in the Q&A box online. Astrid?
Thank you very much for a very rich panel and your insights into this question. There was one word that I've been waiting for and I think hasn't come up at all, and that's incentives. I was wondering whether you've been looking at this at all, because I mean, we see on the one hand, if we start with the researcher side, researchers generally tend to be evaluated by peer-reviewed journal publications, and taking a messy policy question, especially at national level, as entry point for your research is usually not the easiest route into peer-reviewed journals. On the other hand, we know policymakers, even if they may understand the science that has been prepared for their use, especially those that face election cycles, tend to have to make decisions sometimes based on short-term rather than long-term considerations, or in some cases even take decisions that they know not to be the right ones simply because they're under pressure to be seen to be doing something about an urgent problem and otherwise take action. So I was just wondering whether you had been looking at the aspects of incentives to actually bring the science policy interface together to lead to then the proper type of decisions in the long term, and whether this might be something that could come out also further in the reports. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Astrid. And in fact, we have. In fact, this was one of the big things that also came out through the online consultation that we had with scientists and other knowledge holders. And one of the big insights was, again, there are no incentives, as you rightly said. If there's a performance assessment for researchers on the number of papers they've published in high impact factor peer-reviewed journals, and not in terms of contributing to policy or how they are engaged also in global policy dialogues, the incentive is not there. But I'm wondering if anyone of our panelists wants to jump in and answer this question. Jennifer?
I'll just, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I would say too that the role of the science policy interface is to interpret the science that's out there, to translate it for policymakers. And so it's not necessarily that there's a bunch of studies out there that are in and of themselves driven by a policy question, but the experts on science panels are typically reading that basic research and then translating it for policymakers. So I think that it's not necessarily a problem like for the scientists themselves. They're driven by these metrics that universities follow, et cetera, for conducting that research. But I think the science policy interface bodies have a different role, and it's that translation role. But maybe others want to. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, because you're right, but at the same time, I think it's also necessary to look at the structure of the incentives in research organization and make also some kind of evolution in the way people are. I mean, those researchers are evaluated, because we are, as a research organization, increasingly questioning our responsibility to help to address those kind of burning challenges that we have to face, so that we're facing. So, and I think it's also up to those organizations, at least I'm talking now really on the research side and not the policy side, to also move towards that kind of societal demand for changing our way of producing knowledge and not just rely on the broker side. And the way of changing knowledge is also to engage much more with the diversity of stakeholder in knowledge production. And like our colleague from Phan has mentioned, it's really engaging with the diversity of stakeholders. That's the way to have much more impact on policy making also. So, and it's true that it's not always very valued by a research organization, but there is a momentum for that kind of transformational, transdisciplinary kind of approach to knowledge production.
Thanks, Salim. Are there any other questions?
If I may intervene.
Yes, please, Dr. Edsuddin.
Yeah, I think the idea of transformation that we are talking about nowadays in every sector, and this transformation of managing resources, of bringing different stakeholders together, of this effectiveness and interlinkage between the different sectors, also necessitates a transformation and the type of the knowledge that we want to generate and transform into a policy. For example, let me give an example. In the healthcare, after the collapse that the whole world has witnessed in the healthcare systems, I think a lot of the funding and resources should go to financing research in public health. Of course, it's very important to finance research for cancer, for curative care. But since we are all going towards primary health care, in order to go to universal health coverage, we have to spend some of the resources on prevention and primary health care. And this transformation should be present in the mindset globally of the different organizations, whether the WHO, whether UN agencies. Here we have to face an important question or challenge with a lot of states and governments decreasing the amount of money allocated to research and putting most of the resources for research or generating or the funds for research come from the private sector. And here we have to understand the challenge that we are facing in the private sector. The states and state institutions have to balance this relationship and regulate this relationship between the private sector and the public sector for the well-being of the society. Because we cannot go on with the same way after the collapse that we have witnessed, the multi-dimensional crisis that we have witnessed globally. So here there is a lot of stress and focus about this relationship and the governance of the financing. It's very important to make this trade-off. And also, we always talk about policymakers and science interfacing. I think we have also to introduce the concept of social movement and science interfacing, because this will help in facing these difficulties and these challenges.
Thank you. There was a question there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh. Yep.
Hi, my name is Amal. I'm representing the Canadian Youth Delegation with the United Nations Association in Canada. I just want to thank all the panelists for sharing your insights. My question is specifically, this could be for Jennifer and Patrick, as well as Thembi now that you're back online. We speak a lot about this concept of stakeholder consultations and engagement in this context with key food systems actors. And we're also talking about rethinking the ways that we engage with power. Jennifer, you spoke a little bit about power differentiating between those, in policymaking spaces and those who are actually in communities. So I'm currently pursuing my studies in policy, and I also come from a community development space. So when we're talking about capacity building and reshifting power, what does this really look like in more tangible ways? Like, what advice would you give to policymakers apart from just setting a one-time consultative process? And how can we ensure that the process and the engagement we have with communities actually follows through in a much more long-term sense as well? So long-term run. Thank you.
Tembe, you want to start first, and then we'll go back to Jennifer?
Okay, I can give it a go. I think one of the things that I would say would be a good way to do that is by making use of existing community platforms instead of forming new ones. It's building on what's already there and what the communities are comfortable with. I think in a lot of the communities in the countries where we work as FunPan, we find that there are existing platforms where communities engage on a number of different issues, and they have their own leadership that is selected by the community members themselves. What needs to happen is the policymakers need to come down to the level of the communities and be able to meet them at the point where they are most comfortable and be able to talk their language, sit where they are sitting, and just be open. I think we have sort of had this happening at a research sort of level where we say that the researchers need to go to the ground and, you know, and they need to sort of become part of the communities. So I think the same thing needs to happen with policymakers. They should not come from a lofty position where they are the authority and the power, but they need to recognize the existing power structures within the community. They need to recognize the sort of developed processes and platforms that exist within the communities. Thanks.
Jennifer, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and I know that's a big issue in environmental policy making at the national level in Canada, for example, is developing frameworks for meaningful engagement with communities to ensure, you know, policies are co-created rather than sort of top-down with a, you know, a quick consultation and that's it kind of thing. That's not the best way for meaningful engagement. So I think what we need are frameworks for continual engagement in meaningful ways with affected communities. But I think it's going to look different in national science policy frameworks and international. So for just to give the example, in the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, we have consultative processes that are online consultations that invite wide input into the various reports that we write, but because we're on tight timelines, we're dealing with global scale problems, we have to do that as an online consultation, where I think at the national level it would look more like we just heard, in sort of more meeting with, engaging with local communities that, you know, and understanding those communities and their dynamics to bring that into the policy space. But I don't know if we have, you know, there are different guidance documents being developed. I know they're being developed in Canada, and I'm sure in other countries as well, about how to achieve meaningful engagement. But I think it's something that we have to continually work towards improvement in that respect.
Did I see a question there? That's the last question, then we don't have time.
Thank you very much. My name is Christine Yonghong. I'm a professor at Ghent University in Belgium. Very interesting discussion, but I sometimes observe, or I think the most difficult part or the most challenging part is which field of research, for example, GMO, the highly debated topic, from the social science point of view is clearly not acceptable to the majority of consumers, but then from natural science point of view or biotechnology point of view is very useful, it's likely to be safe, and it's gonna be one of the most effective strategy for climate change mitigation. So when it comes to policy making, how do we prioritize which field of science that we should follow? Thank you.
That's a very good question, and this is something also we've been grappling with, because it's not just the science, right? There are also other kinds of knowledges that are coming, and you cannot have hierarchies that this is more important, or if you get other kinds of knowledge, then the science is diluted. So it's really also about getting all the stakeholders. But maybe I'll let Patrick jump in here.
Yeah, thank you, Preet. Well, I would address that by saying science should not prescribe in those situations. Science may enlighten on basis of the evidence, And even on controversial issues, science can enlighten in very different ways according to disciplines and according to the wealth of knowledge. So one of the issues we completely forget about in looking at science is how to address controversies. And the difficult decisions to be made in the future are about controversies, are about issues where there are different and diverging points of view, and where there is a need to, not for science to say what is the truth, but for science to help stakeholders decide upon what is their wish and what is the way forward. And that also call for two issues. Number one is the role of science in looking at that, in enlightening and participating in controversial process in the society. And number two, it brings us back to the issue of consultation, which relies on three pillars. Number one is having information accessible to all the stakeholders which are involved. Number two is to generating a safe space to organize the dialogue with a method. The consultation, the way consultation occurs matters. And number three is to strengthen the capacity of those stakeholders who usually do not have voice in this process. And this is why the guide, the framework that have been referred to by Salim and by Preet is so important and interesting. There is a need to really get a framework to move forward.
Thank you, Patrick. And indeed, scientific findings are very essential, but they don't always provide a singular course of action. Now, unfortunately, we are running out of time. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I'm not going to try and summarize everything, but just a few key things. We heard about the science of solutions. We heard about socializing science, a holistic approach, the importance of independence within the iTrace principles, the need to connect the dots between knowledge and action, getting all the stakeholders together. And then also what we heard was that we are not starting from scratch. There is a lot to build on. We need to pool our collective intelligence. So with that, another round of applause for our panelists, but also for the troopers who stayed in the room till late. Thank you.
Bye-bye.